Well, thank you so much, Dave. Boy, it's just such a pleasure to be here with you folks. And those of you who are joining us, thank you so much for joining. It's really a joy and an honor to present to such dedicated ministry leaders. And I just pray that God can use this to enhance your own outreach for Jesus. You know, mainstream newspapers and magazines and television and radio can influence millions of people. But some Christian communicators have faulty assumptions about dealing with the mainstream media. They think that the secular media is the enemy or out to get them, or that God couldn't use them in mainstream print media or electronic media. And you know, you yourself, you might think, well, who can afford it? You might think, I don't have the money, I don't have the expertise to produce a program and buy television time. You might think, how could I get a newspaper to cover me? Well, there are several things you can do. You can appear as a guest on a secular talk show or interview program. Sometimes countries are called chat programs, or variety show. Or you could be interviewed by a print journalist or contribute an article to a secular publication. And that way somebody else pays for the production and the broadcasting and the publication and the distribution and does much of the work to help you influence thousands and even millions of people for Christ. Now, I certainly don't claim to be an expert on this, and I don't have all the answers, but by God's grace, I've seen a fair amount of success over the years in communicating Christ via the secular broadcast, and print that have worked for me can work for you as well. But first, let me tell you some stories. As a young believer during my third year in university, I wrote a paper for an abnormal psychology course discussing a biblical therapy for anxiety. Copy of the paper to the author of our textbook, a psychologist at UCLA, University of California, Los Angeles. The paper said he was going to read it to his students, and he asked permission to quote from it in his textbook revision. Third year university, I picked my jaw up off the floor and said, by all means. And actually, I first said a copy so they'd see that their son had not gone overboard with his campus Christian involvement. I was involved with Campus Crusade. My folks were beginning to wonder what had happened to me. Well, that summer, I met this professor personally at his home and shared the Savior. And the next edition of his textbook contained a short portion about religion, part of it on the screen in just a moment, and it included part of my faith story. And I began to tell psychology professors that I was a case in their, and many professors would invite me to speak in their classes. And this really helped launch, or kickstart, I should say, what became a global speaking ministry presenting Christ in academia and the media. But basically, God worked to communicate Christ to thousands of students and lecturers or professors through a secular psychology textbook. Another story. A few weeks before Easter in 1971, I began to wonder why nobody had published an article on evidences for Jesus' resurrection in our campus newspaper, the Duke Chronicle. I thought this university is intellectually sophisticated. The evidences for the resurrection are sound. Students and professors needed to know this. Why doesn't somebody write this article? I kind of grumbled. After several days, I wondered, maybe I should write this. What a novel idea. I think it was really the Holy Spirit, touching my heart in that. But I wrote the article, and I took it to the editor, who was Jewish, and he read it as we sat in his office, and I prayed silently as he was reading it, eyes open, just kind of, I was looking at him as I prayed, but I prayed that he would run it. And after a few minutes, he looked up and he asked, can we put this phrase in italics? And he was talking about the punchline at the end of the evidences where I said, Christ is risen. You see, while I had been praying, he had already decided to use it. So the article ran opposite the editorial page, and I was encouraged by this reception, so I took it to the local city newspaper in Durham, North Carolina, late one afternoon, but I ran into just one editor there who was on deadline. He was too busy to talk. So next door, I showed the article to the local radio station manager, and he very warmly invited me to record it in his studio right there for broadcast that weekend. God had used my efforts to spread his word and the truth that Jesus lives. He'd done that via the mainstream secular media, and this really excited me. But I had no idea what was going to happen in the future, what lay ahead. because the Lord began to use other versions of the short article, and local newspapers, both small and large, in the U.S. would run it, from the North Myrtle Beach Times to the Long Beach Press-Telegram. And over time, and now it's 4 decades and counting, the article's taken on a life of its own. Of course, the fact that Easter keeps rolling around each year certainly helps, but the Manila Bulletin in the Philippines published in their Easter Sunday edition, 250,000 circulation. The Salvation Army ran it in their Easter War Cry magazine, over 1 million circulation, 1.2 million. The American Tract Society turned it into an outreach pamphlet in English and Chinese. And now it's on the web. And by God's grace, it's been used by websites and publications based in a lot of nations, including here in the United States and Canada, India, China, Abu Dhabi, Australia, United Kingdom, Brazil, Mexico, places like that. A Chinese website even used it in both text and audio formats to help Chinese speakers learn English. People send the article in emails to their friends and acquaintances. It's just like the Energizer Bunny. It just seems to keep going and going and going. But God gets the credit for all this, of course. He did the raising from the dead. I simply told the story, as have many others. Let's look now at mainstream television, some stories about that. Now, much of what I'll share about television also relates to radio and to print media interviews, but some stories first and then some how-tos. Once a prominent television talk show in Quito, Ecuador had scheduled me and a coworker for 3 successive programs. And we met with the hostess in her office the day before the first show, but she was skeptical. She thought, well, viewers might not relate to Americans, or that the translations, we were going to be speaking by translation, that those would bore the audience. So our local coordinator negotiated with her, and my coworker and I prayed silently for God to turn her heart. And finally, the hostess agreed to allow 1 of the 3 appearances, but she said she would cancel the next 2 if the first one went poorly. Well, I'm pleased to say that God worked, and all 3 programs were very well received, and the telephone lines just lit up with callers who were eager to ask questions about life and love and peace, and the hostess invited us back. Another time in Bulgaria in Eastern Europe, I had the privilege, by God's grace, of appearing on a popular TV program with 4 million viewers. And the program mixed music videos with TV interviews. It was kind of a cross between Oprah and MTV. Magdalena Malaeva, the tennis star, was also a guest that particular day. And the host asked me questions about love and sex and relationships and success. And at one point he said, you know, our young people in Bulgaria are losing hope. Communism has fallen. They don't know their purpose in life. Many are committing suicide. Do you have anything that could give hope to our young people? Well, Paul said to pray, the Apostle Paul said to pray for open doors for the gospel. I'm not the most brilliant person in the world, but I perceived that this was an open door. And by God's grace, I was able to explain clearly to 4 million Bulgarians that Christ makes all the difference in life. And all this was using the state-owned television studios that for years had served up Marxist propaganda. Here in the United States, the Lord opened doors in secular television programs across our country. And these have drawn people to my evangelistic meetings. They've sown seeds for the gospel. They've provided positive public. I'm so grateful for God to these, and I just want to give him all the glory. Now, in your notes, I'll show you some more specifics about that later, but there's some links to video clips of some of my presentations and a couple of Luis's on television and radio. And I'll mention just one of them that's there at this point. It's from an Kelly and Company, one of the most popular talk shows in Detroit, Michigan. And the host, John Kelly, link and go to it online and download the video if you want. But John Kelly's interviewing me. And the clip, I put it there because it can illustrate the value of humor in communicating with secular audiences. I think the communication principles will still come through. And also, I should warn you, in digitizing videotape, we had some color issues. And so maybe you can see in the screenshot that's right there in front of you, in that I'm also a lot greener. Greener also and probably ministry experience too. I was able to, in the show, I was able to talk about spiritual matters later in the show, but the humor can really help open up people. Kelly and Company was very kind to have me on 4 different times. The viewing audience grew to over 200,000 viewers once when I was in Ecuador by satellite. You never know the impact that being on television or in your ministry. Okay, if you have your outline there, it's easy to follow along, and I'll be saying a lot of things, but a lot of the content is there in the outline. Secular TV and radio talk shows and print media. Let's look at some of those benefits. Well, first benefit is reaching non-believers. To touch lots of people who might never tune in a Christian broadcast or read a Christian publication. And these folks may be more psychologically receptive to your message than if they were viewing a Christian program or reading a Christian magazine where their defenses. Second benefit, increased exposure. Secular media allows you to expose many more people to the gospel. Third, low cost. Production, airtime, publication cost, those things cost you nothing. Meeting promotion. As I mentioned, secular media can help increase attendance at your meetings. Number 5, credibility in the minds of the public. Number 6, public relations can provide positive public relations. And number 7, fundraising. Indirectly, because of all this, your secular media appearance efforts. Now, I want to emphasize the word indirectly emphasize. Of course, on a secular TV and invite viewers to send you checks. You won't, will you? Please promise me you won't. Potential donors see you in the media, it may help them to warm up to supporting your outreach through other appeals that you make. Okay, let's look at some practical tips for can you get these opportunities. You might say, well, this sounds great, but how do I get on TV or radio shows or get a newspaper to cover me? I'm not qualified. I'm inexperienced. I'm not famous. Why would they want me? Well, I can identify very well with this concern, and this story from my past may encourage you. Very early in my career as a traveling speaker with Campus Crusade for Christ, which is now called Cru, I prepared an event manual for my host to use to prepare for my visit. And Josh McDowell and Andre Cole, 2 very well-known staff and traveling evangelists, were very kind to let me use their own event manuals as kind of a guide as I prepared mine. But when I got to their sections on scheduling TV shows, I left that out of my manual because I thought, well, who wants to see me on television? I'm not a seasoned professional like those guys. Well, one of my first trips that year was to Western Michigan University. And a month or so before I went, my local coordinator phoned to ask if I'd like to be on a local TV talk show. It seemed one of their Christian leaders in the community had a contact at the local station and could get me on the show. And I said, well, sure. And actually ended up appearing on 2 programs on WKZO in Kalamazoo, Michigan. And I remember very well sitting in the studio as the hosts were asking me questions about my campus speaking and about my presentations on love and sex and marriage. And I was able to very clearly talk about Christ. And I thought to myself, here I am, sitting in this television studio talking about Jesus, and somebody else is paying all the money, doing all the work to get my message out to thousands. I thought, this is great. We need to do this more. So God can use you. Now, you may be a traveling speaker. And by the way, calling yourself a traveling speaker or a communicator or motivator can help open doors that calling yourself an evangelist might close. About 30 years ago, it was 1988, I was introducing Luis Palau at an evangelist gathering in Washington, D.C. And in introducing myself to the audience, before I introduced Luis, I referred to myself as a traveling speaker. And Luis got up, and in his inimitable, partly playful, partly sarcastic way, he, before the audience, bemoaned the fact that too many evangelists had compromised by calling themselves traveling speakers rather than evangelists. Well, about 10 years or so later, I noticed with great interest that LPEA began to call their events festivals rather than crusades. And more recently, of course, the Luis Palau Evangelistic Association began calling itself the Luis Palau Association. Now, if I were a cynical or a mean person, I might rub that in. But am I going to? Not at all. I assure you I'm above that. And I think, frankly, it's great that the Palau Association has adapted to the times without sacrificing its gospel emphasis. But in your own situation, maybe you can bill yourself as a youth specialist, or a communications consultant, or a motivational speaker, or a Christian activist, or a family activist. And somebody who travels and speaks can be a human interest story. A lot of shows are looking for people who are in touch with people in their areas who are knowledgeable about topics that interest their viewers or listeners or readers for newspapers. You see, folks, the gospel you proclaim relates very clearly to topics like love and sex and marriage and loneliness and stress and freedom and success and world peace and inner peace. In some countries, government regulations encourage TV and radio stations to give exposure to people and events that can help serve the public interest, so you can actually be helping the station accomplish their goals. Now, here's some principles for getting on programs and getting media interviews. And by the way, much of the advice I'm presenting today is in a manual that I helped write on secular TV and radio talk shows, A Means to Share Christ. And there's a link to it at the bottom of your notes. I'll refer to that a little bit later, but I'll hit some of the highlights of the content that's in there, but I encourage you to check out that manual, and it's there online. Okay, first in getting secular media opportunities, pray. Proverbs 21:1 says, "The king's heart is like channels of water in the hands of the Lord. He turns it wherever he wishes." God can turn the hearts of TV producers and editors to open doors for the gospel. Second, select some appropriate topics. Think through how the gospel relates to themes that already interest viewers or listeners or readers. What do people in the audience you're trying to reach talk about and think about? Maybe relationships or love or marriage or stress or success or loneliness or purpose or terrorism, the occult or peace or war or poverty or disease or AIDS or famine or racism or abortion or women's rights, all kinds of, lots of things. Of course, you can't be an expert in all of these, but you can become proficient or intelligent about several of them. Like the Apostle Paul said, I try to find common ground with everyone so that I can bring them to Christ. Number 3, emphasize your strengths. Your own traveling and speaking can be selling points. Here are some things to stress in your promotion. In how many places have you spoken? To what types of audiences do you speak? What are their needs and problems? What solutions do you offer? What topics do you speak about? And again, secular topics offer the best possibilities, though sometimes the fact that you're a Christian representative or Christian activist can help you get an interview. And how have you been received as you've been speaking? All those kinds of things are human interest points. Number 4, emphasize newsworthy items. A lot of media gatekeepers are willing to cover what the industry would call hard news stories, even if the story does not support the station owner's personal philosophy. Hard news would be things like significant people, unusual events, catastrophes, and so forth. Number 5, you might consider writing a book or an article. Help expand your ministry. Being an author can help you, though it's not essential. A good article, especially in a secular publication, might do the same. And if you write a book with mainstream media in mind, choose a theme with secular interest that also allows you to present Christ. For instance, a book about different views of predestination probably would not open too many doors with secular television or newspapers. But secular topics, like the ones I've mentioned earlier, can open doors. So write with the secular reader in mind. Now, let me mention here another heads up for another video clip that's linked to in your notes there. This is a program in the Philippines called Oh No, It's Johnny. It was a very popular show in Manila in the Philippines, and the host is a humorist. He actually was the Johnny Carson of the Philippines. And in this interview, if you see it later on, you can download it, or I think you can even watch it there streaming online. In the interview, we've told some jokes and talked about love, sex, and marriage, and then as the interview picks up, the subject changes to life after death. And as you watch this, you'll see that this host interrupts a lot, and that happens. You got to be flexible in these situations because they control the pace often. He interrupts a lot with questions, and in this one, he asked me some questions that really opened the door for spiritual input. And so I just encourage you to check that one out too. That might give you some ideas about other ways and ways to relate when you're on the air on radio or television. But then we've gone to points 1 through 5. Now point 6, determine potential shows or publications. You or your associates can watch the programs that you might want to be on, or kind of look through them to see which ones would be good, or read newspapers in the cities you're going to visit to discover potential outlets and what kinds of guests and topics they feature and who the producers or the editors are. And you can prepare a specific approach that will convince the gatekeeper to use you. Design your approach, I encourage you, to meet their objectives. Remember, you always want to think through the gatekeeper, that is the person who makes decisions about whether or not you're on the show or do the media interview. Excuse me. What are they interested in? And they're interested in things that will interest their audience because they want lots of readers and viewers so that the advertisers will be able to expose lots of people to their product. So always think about the gatekeeper and the audience and what their interests are. That's how you want to focus as you're writing and as you're speaking and seeking interviews. And you may want to consult a media outlets guide for program and contacts information. Google the words publicity outlets to locate several that are for sale. And point number 7, send some promotional material. And again, I'm grateful for Google here. Google the words how to write a press release for ideas. I did that and found loads recently and found loads and loads of ideas. CBS News has one that comes up there that's really a very, very helpful guide. You might want to send the media gatekeeper a personal cover letter with information about you, about your lecture topics, or if you've written a book, a copy of your book, and include an attractive photo and a copy of your travel schedule. And as you do this more and more, you'll be able to request and perhaps get letters of recommendation from other TV producers or radio producers that you can include in your packet. And again, as you design your material, think like a non-Christian. What will a non-believing media gatekeeper or audience member, reader, viewer, listener, what will they want? And that's what you're trying to do. Okay, point number 8, make personal contact. Have an associate contact the gatekeeper by phone or in person to follow up with the mailing and encourage him to use you. And you know, you can call yourself, you can contact him yourself, but it's almost always best that somebody other than you makes that contact. Maybe you can enlist an influential person, like maybe if you have a respected government leader that's familiar with you, or a business person, but somebody to make the contact for you. Okay, how do you prepare for your TV or radio appearance or media interview? Excuse me, let's assume that your team or your local hosts have lined you up on a secular media interview and it's happening in 2 weeks and you're starting to feel nervous and your palms are getting sweaty. How do you get ready for the big event? Well, again, the first point is to pray. Remember, you're in a spiritual battle. Watch and pray. Second, I encourage you to study TV and radio and newspapers. The more you know about the situation you will face, the better you can prepare. Observe how non-believers think and how they ask and answer questions and what studio audiences laugh at when you're watching TV shows or listening to radio shows. Watch effective Christian communicators as they present on secular shows. Rick Warren, a pastor in Southern California, I'm sure many of you are familiar with him, he's excellent in these situations. Anne Graham Lotz usually does a very good job on secular television. But let me encourage you, but remember that famous Christians may be able to more freely and directly communicate spiritual content in the mainstream media because the hosts and the viewers expect that of them. And so you may need to be more subtle or work harder to communicate the connection between your own spiritual perspective and your secular theme. Number 3, read up on your topic. If my interview was about one of my books, for instance, I often would skim my book the day before an interview to refresh my memory. And also learn how the news of the day relates to your theme. I've had situations where I've prepared to the nth degree, and then there's some late-breaking news that the commentator or the host wants to ask me about, and so I want to make sure I've checked out the news of that day so that I'm ready to make a comment about it. Relate to my subject, they might ask me about it. So check the news out before you go to this interview. Number 4, practice short, concise answers. Now, depending on the program format, U.S. television hosts, often radio hosts too, like short answers. And I like to practice answers that are maybe 20 to 40 seconds. You might want to develop some short quotable quotes or one-liners and sound bites to communicate your points. And I've spoken and written a lot on, appeared on media too, about things like love, sex, and marriage. And these are some of the one-liners that I often use in those situations. The time you may think your partner deserves love the least may be the time they need it the most. Sex is not the key to love. Love is the key to sex. Sexual foreplay involves the round-the-clock relationship. A God who created sex can't be all bad. God is not down on the use of sex. He's down on the misuse of sex. Now, by the way, I'm thankful to lots of people for these quotes. My father gave one of those, my wife, Josh McDowell, a couple of those, so I'm very grateful for standing on the shoulders of others who've gone before me. And I encourage you to develop 3 or 4 point outlines to answers to questions that you might get a lot. And I would try to memorize the main points and the key phrases in my answers because it can build my confidence and it can help me to communicate with clarity and credibility. And the aim here, you know, it's not to stifle your creativity or your spontaneity, but it's to help you communicate effectively. And remember, that unrelenting psychological clock is tick, tick, ticking in the attention spans and minds of your audience and host. Now, by this time in my presentation today, I know that the clock is ticking in your own minds as well. But realize that the last 4 sentences I spoke took about 20 seconds, about the same span that you might have for some of your on-air answers for television or radio. Think of the questions that people often ask you as you speak and provide them in advance to the producer. It's because it's their job to create questions like that for the host. Many will be really grateful. And if the host fails to ask you some of the questions for which you prepared, maybe you can weave them into your discussion. Well, you know, John, that reminds me of a question I'm often asked. And state that question, then answer your own question. I encourage you to have a dry run or a practice interview with a friend beforehand, a few days before. The friend will quiz you with sample questions. And encourage your friend to be hard on you because it's better to make an adjustment before you go on the air or before you meet the writer. Number 5, practice humor. I can't emphasize this enough. It's so valuable to use humor in these situations. It can help your host, the studio audience, the viewing audience, readers, all of you learn to relax. And it can help drive your points home. Here's some of the lines I've often used in discussing love, sex, and marriage. Love is a feeling you feel you're going to feel when you have a feeling you feel you haven't felt before. Regarding, if people ask me about premarital sex, I'll say, well, you know, different people have different views. Personally, I never kissed my wife until the day we got married. Now, I did kiss my fiance. She wasn't my wife until the day we got married. I think I can hear that huge moan out there in cyberspace. I got married on that great day of wilting, when the pastor says, wilt thou, and you wilt. Well, try to practice humor and use that. It can really make a big difference in softening the soil. Reconfirm with, point 6, reconfirm with the producer or the editor or the writer. A few days beforehand, call them on the phone to discuss the themes and maybe suggest some possible questions. Once a producer asked for sample questions that were appropriate to my book, The Other Side of Life, which deals with near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences. And among my suggested questions was one about the significance of Jesus' resurrection. About 3 or 4 minutes into the interview, the host asked me that question. So I got to very briefly explain some resurrection evidences and the gospel over 100,000 viewers. And you might ask, too, if you can bring a slide, a little picture of, if you've written a book, of your book, or maybe of your local speaking information for them to feature on the air. Number 7, dress appropriately. Blue usually shows up better than white on color TV. I'm wearing an Oxford cloth light blue. From bright red or biscuit, those can distort the. Use facial makeup. Magnify your blemishes. Shine. 10 pounds to your appearance. Keep your hands away from your face. Now, I had an itch on to sneak in a scratch right there while I was illustrating that point. But keep your hands away from your face. Look at the host or the questioner and not off into space. If you look at the camera, make it only a brief glance, unless it's like a remote interview where the camera, the audience sees that you're paying attention to them. But and avoid glancing at the monitor. Now, the monitor for me, where I can see my face, is off to my left. But if I turn there, you see that I'm looking at it, and it kind of might distract you. So I just see it out of the corner of my eye. Have somebody else record your appearance so that you can see your rule. The more animated you are, the better. And I've learned this through guidance. I'd ask the producer after the show, what can I do to improve? One producer in Detroit said, you can never be too animated. Because I realized that often the person at home is just looking at your face in the TV or the computer screen. Could be a lot of distractions, maybe screaming kids, housework. Animated facial expressions and gestures can also help hold. Keep a careful watch on the time. Once, very early in my career, I failed to watch the time in an interview, and I was in Christ, and it would have been the very next sentence when the host had to cut me off because my time was up. And find out how many segments you're going to be on, if it's a live interview or even if it's recorded for the future, and the length of each segment. And during the commercial breaks, if there are any, reconfirm these times with the host, because the schedule can change a lot as the program progresses. Position your wristwatch so that you can glance at it discreetly. You don't want to be obvious like this, because that gets the audience's mind on how much time is left, just like it did now as I mimicked there looking at my watch. It can be distracting. Number 3, aim for short, crisp answers. You want to balance between the simple yes or no and a speech. Watch the host's body language for clues on when to stop talking. Point 4, use colorful illustrations and lots of stories. And these often communicate best on TV and radio, and they can be much more effective than a barrage of facts. Try to connect emotionally with your host and with your audience. Emotional connection may be your most significant. And balance your responses with secular and Christian material. It's usually best to lead with the secular. And look for opportunities to introduce your faith and show the connection between the secular theme and the faith perspective. Now, the manual that's linked to there in your notes gives some good transitions from the secular to the spiritual. Let me just mention a few. You might want to use the Christian perspective transition. Well, John, I'm a Christian, and a biblical perspective on racism is, and continue to explain that. Or the testimony transition. Frankly, I struggled for years with self-esteem issues. And then in university, I met some students who helped me understand some things about the spiritual side of life that helped me learn to love myself. And what they told me was, and go on and explain about Christ, but work very hard to help your audience see how your spiritual perspective relates to their felt needs. You want to be sensitive and don't force your gospel material, but ask God for wisdom and take it as far as it seems appropriate. Number 6, avoid Christianese. The Bible says that all you sinners need to repent and trust in the finished work of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, who through his propitiatory sacrifice on Calvary's cross made atonement for you so you could be justified, redeemed, sanctified, and gloriously saved. Click. Break to the commercial, quick. You can hear the producer saying that. How about something like this instead? You know, the biblical documents explain that humans have an emptiness, an inner void, if you will, a longing to love and to be loved. And Jesus of Nazareth said he came to fill that void, to offer hope and purpose. Use language that relates to your listeners. There's an article linked to in your notes called Speaking Your Audience's Language. It's got a really helpful chart with loads of ways to translate Christianese into normal human speak. Love your audience. I really like Josh McDowell's 3 keys to public communication. Do your homework, love your audience, be yourself. Often the quality of your character persuades more than the content of your argument. To exhibit God's love through you. You're not there necessarily to win an argument, but to share good news. Harsh or overly dogmatic, you may lose. American audiences often perceive evangelical Christians as pushy, judgmental, angry, controlling, liberal haters. Surprise them. Be kind and winsome. Your civility may be contagious. And number 8, don't try to remember everything from this workshop on the day of your appearance. You may become paranoid. Prepare spirit to bring things. We're writing for mainstream media, and let me just wrap up with this in the next few minutes before we open up for questions. Another opportunity to spread God's truth involves placing opinion pieces in the op-ed or opinion pages of local. Now, one of our fellow NGA members, Clint Decker from Kansas, has really run with this concept. He's got a column called Hope for Today. It's a monthly column that started in 2000 and online, and it's tied to current news or interesting topics, and it weaves in encouraging spiritual truths. And you can see his website there, greatawakenings, plural.org, and it's also linked to there in the handout. And when I made this a PowerPoint not too long ago, they were in across 10 states, but breaking news just got the word last week that they're now in 296 papers with their columns, and the total combined circulation of those papers is over 1 million. So to Clint for the wonderful work that he's been doing there, and I suspect he'd love to have you look at what he's doing and ask him questions if you want to know how he did it. But it's just terrific to see that happening. In our own work, this has really become a major emphasis. In 1995, I began to submit columns to the San Bernardino, California Sun, the county where I lived in Southern California, and to other papers around the nation. And the Sun, the Indianapolis Star, the Tallahassee Democrat, and a bunch of smaller city and county newspapers also ran some of my columns. And over time, this morphed into syndicated columns distributed now to 2,700 outlets. And by God's grace, over 1,700 websites and newspapers and magazines, Christian and secular, they're based on 6 continents, have now used our material in any of 14 languages, and God gets the glory for this. You can use the articles too at no cost. It's gratis, and the information's there in your handout. I used to focus on ethical insights from the headlines, such as forgiving Bernie Madoff, ? But then I found I could reach a wider audience by writing about current films and television, and including faith angles in the articles. And again, by God's blessing, the motion picture and television industries have recognized this reach, and the studios and some of the networks through their agencies really actively promote their films and programs to us, seeking our coverage. And again, I thank God for this, but they've even funded travel to set visits and premieres and to interview actors and producers and other things. Now, you know, we're not on their A-list. If the president of MGM is considering making a movie, he doesn't say, quick, get Rusty on the phone, let's see what he thinks. But it's an enhanced or increased access. And just some examples, some recent and current projects that we've had include articles about the Peanuts movie. easy to talk about spiritual issues, talking about Charles Schulz and Peanuts. The Deepwater Horizon movie. Batman versus Superman. There are many Christ parallels in the Superman story. The Real MVP, about Kevin Durant's mom. He was the most valuable player in the National Basketball Association a few years ago and was the NBA of the finals this past year, and they're both dedicated Christians. CNN had their Finding Jesus series, using both liberal and conservative scholars to the gospel stories. Wonder Woman, that released about 5 weeks ago, a delightful film, easy to draw some spiritual parallels there. I tried to, hope did a good job. You can see the article on my website. And then Dunkirk. I'm excited about this. I'm going to see it Monday night. It opens the Christmas story told from the animal's point of view. Tyler Perry and Oprah Winfrey voice camels. Chris Christopherson voices a donkey. And the studios let us see the films before the release so we can publish them the week before opening day when the public interest is really high. And the readers want to read timely movie articles, and publishers want to publish them during this time right before the movie opens. And the studios invest millions in global publicity, and we get to ride these waves gratis to take the gospel into needy hearts. And really, when you think about it, isn't what this NGA webinar is all about? It's trying to inspire you to use your creative mind and talents to tap resources that can help you spread the gospel widely and cost efficiently. When I first started, I had no idea that our media outreach would expand like this, and I suspect many of you can meet or exceed these levels of impact. In 1 Chronicles 4:10, Jabez asked God to enlarge his border or expand his influence, and God did it. Maybe he wants to do the same for you and for your ministry. I pray that he does. Well, let me now open it up for questions, and Dave Jones is going to be kind enough to field questions that you might have and perhaps ask some of his own. So, Dave, what do you got for me?
Well, Rusty, thanks. We do have quite a few questions here. Okay, let's start with this. The question is, my experience has been that too many mainstream journalists are antagonistic toward evangelical Christians, especially evangelists, even if we call ourselves something else, and they come to an interview with a negative story already written in their head. So what practical things can we do to quickly disarm a somewhat hostile interviewer?
You know, that's an excellent question, and that's true. Sometimes, no matter how hard you work, the interviewer has preconceived ideas, and they also may have just a mission to get a story with headlines. And sometimes the thing about how the Christian acts this way or whatever is going to get them angry. I would, the more you know in advance, the better. And so I would try to, if you know who the interviewer is, I'd try to research them, find out what they've written, maybe see what's playing in the news that week, so that you're not caught by surprise. And if there is a controversial issue that you think they might want to ask you about, have some things prepared that might disarm them. One idea comes to mind, for instance. I could, maybe imagine this happening. It's just hypothetical, but just to give you an example of the type of thing I'm talking about here. My recent article about the Wonder Woman movie. Wonder Woman is a kind of an exciting story. I grew up watching Superman and had my Superman outfit and everything, and would watch that on TV and read the comics and stuff. Well, Wonder Woman has some very strong feminist aspects in the past. The man who invented Wonder Woman was a Harvard-trained, Harvard Law and also Harvard psychologist, and he was very strong in the feminist movement. He was the aunt of his lover was Margaret Sanger, who was the founder of Planned Parenthood. Gloria Steinem, the famous feminist editor and writer, an editor of Ms. Magazine, founder of Ms. Magazine, is a very strong Wonder Woman fan. And I wanted to bring those items in my article, and so I did, but I did them all without saying anything negative about radical feminism or Margaret Sanger or Gloria Steinem. I did it because I was trying to reach those types of people. So, for instance, if I was in an interview with somebody who was asking me about Christian perspective on women, I would maybe want to mention that Wonder Woman story. That just comes to my mind, and talk about the fact that Gloria Steinem was such a Wonder Woman fan. When she found out that the comic book directors took away Wonder Woman's powers, she started lobbying DC Comics to get them to put the powers back, and DC Comics finally relented, and they said, I hope Steinem is happy. I thought that was a delightful story. So see, there I'd be telling a story that might connect with this person whose views might be different from my own. That's one thing that you can do. Another thing is to pray. Another thing is to look for humor. One way that I would disarm people too is I might say, Bob, I really appreciate that question. And let me say, I suspect that you and I may have some things that we agree on a lot. We may have some things that disagree. The approach I try to take whenever I speak, if I'm in a university, if I'm on television or radio or whatever, is not that I'm coming here to force my views down your throat, but just to get you to think. And on that question you just asked about which there's loads of controversy, let me just throw in this thought, and then maybe say something that could be, not going to fan the flames more. Those are the things that come to my mind. Perhaps if I thought more, I could have some more cogent one-liners, but that's the type of approach I would try to take. I try to do everything I can to make them feel that they're on my side of the table, and that I'm welcoming them, and that my hands are not up like this, but my hands are in a welcoming gesture or shaking their hands. Hope those thoughts could be useful.
Good, good. Here's another one, Rusty. Besides not using Christian speak, what are other common mistakes you have witnessed when Christian leaders engage the media?
Excellent question. And this is a real hot button of mine. When I was in graduate school in the UK, it was a secular university. I was there as a Christian. One of my classmates was a Christian. And he told me halfway through one of our terms, he said, I see what you're doing now. You're trying to get on their side of the table. And that's really what I try to do. There are three things. The words Christianese, and that's the simplest part. And then attitude is the second one. And I guess by, let me say ideas would be the second one. And the illustration I just gave of Gloria Steinem and Margaret Sanger and feminism, that would be one of ideas. I might disagree with their ideas, but I can find something positive in it and present that. So words, ideas, and then attitude. Attitude is so important. I see so many people, and Christians, God bless them, in interviews with the mainstream media, who feel like it's their job to win an argument. And I am there in the secular media not to win an argument, but, folks, to win a person and to win lots of people. And I try to think about how would I act if this was my neighbor. Maybe it's my next door neighbor who's maybe, way different from me in terms of politics, in terms of religion, but I'd want to find things that I could do to agree with them, find things to agree with up front. I remember being at Expo 74, a huge conference in Seoul, Korea, and I heard a Bishop Chandu Ray from India, talk about things that he used to connect with Buddhists, particular types of Buddhists in his country. And he said you could start out by talking about the differences, or you could start out by talking about the common points. And he would say, and I'm paraphrasing, in Buddhism we have four noble truths. The first noble truth is that, and I'm drawing a blank here right at the key moment, is that suffering is universal. And as a follower of Jesus, I would agree with that the suffering is a huge problem, needs to be solved. Second noble truth is, if I were speaking to a Buddhist, I might say this politely, second noble truth is that suffering is caused by craving or evil desire. I'd say, well, I agree with that too. It's very similar to a biblical concept of selfishness or sin. Something needs to be done about that. Third noble truth is that the way to eliminate suffering is to eliminate craving. I can agree with that. If you could eliminate selfishness, a lot of the world's problems would be solved. And the fourth noble truth is that we eliminate craving by the eightfold path, which is right behavior, right aspiration, etc. Basically, that type of behavior. And here is where, as a follower of Jesus, I would suggest an alternative, because I tried for many years to live the right kind of life, but I was frustrated. I couldn't do it, especially on the inside. And then I met some students who helped me see that I could have a relationship with God that could give me the strength to live the way I wanted to on the inside. Now, if you're the non-believing Buddhist in that situation, which approach would you prefer? The one that has like hands up, stop, go away, or the one that's welcoming? And so that's the attitude I would encourage you to have. And you know, that you think of the person as a neighbor and a friend and somebody that you'd like to get to know. And you've got to watch your temper, because a lot of times people will say things that are really off the wall and get you really upset. But your job is not necessarily to win an argument, it's to win a person. I don't want to consider them as the enemy. I want to consider them as the lost who knows Jesus. And boy, this affects me emotionally.
Yeah.
I want to do whatever I can within God's plan to reach them.
Well done. Well, yeah, I like that answer. Thanks, Rusty.
Yeah.
Next question. As evangelists, what should we be doing to build trust with the media?
Everything I've just said is important about words, ideas, and attitude, because communication springs from those things. And that another is to get to know them personally. I remember in San Bernardino, California, when I first wanted to submit to the San Bernardino Sun, I looked and researched the newspaper, and I called the opinion page editor and speaker and would love to submit things. Do you accept submissions? He said, oh, yes. And I asked him, and I sent him an article. This was 1995. The Southern Baptists had just apologized for their racist past. It was tried about it to their credit. And so I wrote an article using that as a lead about a Christian perspective on race. Words. Didn't hear. So I called him back, wondered if he got the article. Oh, yes. I'd love to drop in to see him personally. And so I created an excuse and said, I'm going to be down in your area later this week. And he said, sure. So I stopped by to see him, and he was a rather bookish, scholarly sort of guy, lacking somewhat in social skills, but very nice. And we had a lovely chat, and he said, no, I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but I'll get to it. And so I ended the conversation, went back home. Another week, called him back. Did you get a chance to read it? Oh, yes, I read it. Long pause. Oh, well, what did you think of the article? Oh, I liked it. Another long pause on the phone. What do you think you might want to use? Oh, yeah, we're going to use it. And that began what was a great long-term relationship. So personal contact, I would really encourage you to do whatever you can to have personal contact with them. Look for an excuse to see them. Send them a note. I would try to, keep in touch with editors, if I was traveling through the town. So the more personal you can make it, the better. That's the main thought that comes to my mind.
Next question. Rusty, you mentioned having an associate or business person seek media opportunities for you. Do you recommend that a young evangelist have an associate or an assistant or a media agent seek out those opportunities?
Excellent question. I think, yes, if you can get help to do it, that would be great. When I first started doing this was during my Cru years, Campus Crusade, and I had some staff who were able to help me with it. But I remember when we first began to go really big time, especially with television, there was one woman and my publisher who would do it. And I used a book, and again, you play the cards you have. I had a book about love, sex, and marriage, which was written for a secular audience, and it was a great door opener, and it dovetailed with what my campus speaking. But we worked out an arrangement with the publisher where the publisher would send copies of our books to TV producers before we get to the town, and there'd be a cover letter that I believe it was signed by, it was written, frankly, I can't remember if it was written from the book publisher's publicist or from our person, but it included some material, and then it said, one of our, I or one of our colleagues will give you a call to see if something like this might work. And so then the person from my office would call them to see if they wanted to schedule me, and they would, and then they'd coordinate that with the local host. So I remember asking this once of a TV producer as I was brand new at this, is it best for me to call or is it best for the other person? He said, in this industry, we know that the guests want to be on the shows. Everybody knows that. But it's almost always best to have somebody else do it, so it's not like the guest is tooting their own horn. So yes, I would try to find a friend or a colleague who could do it. That first one I did in Michigan, in Kalamazoo, Michigan, that was, divine coincidence. God orchestrated that, but it was a woman who knew a Christian woman who knew a host through a local women's club or something, and that's how they arranged it. But yes, if you can have somebody else do it, you can be the brains behind setting the operation up and making sure it works, but the initial contact, I would recommend having somebody else do it. That's for television and radio. Now, for the newspapers, if you're the writer, it doesn't hurt for you to do that because you're the professional who's going to be liaising with them about the written material.
Rusty, if you're good to stay with us, we're at the top of the hour, but we've got quite a number of questions here. So if you're okay,
absolutely.
I've got a few more questions. Are you good? I think the NGA members that are participating would love to spend a little more time with you. So next question. On the few occasions when the media has sought me out, it is because they are only interested, in my opinion, on abortion or gay marriage and are not interested in anything else. How, without appearing to be a coward, do we avoid highly divisive, politicized topics and point the interview to the good news of Jesus Christ?
Boy, that's a real challenge. This reminds me of the way I cut my teeth in speaking ministry was in secular university classrooms. I would go in as an invited guest to speak on like a biblical view of love, sex, and marriage, or the historicity of the resurrection, or whatever. And I'd speak for about 30 minutes and then open it up for questions, and we would get all kinds. And I learned to think on my feet. Abortion and gay marriage are really tough. But here's the way I would answer it in a situation like that. Dave, let me pretend that you're the host and we're on a secular interview and you've just asked me about the subject of abortion. And again, I would have practiced this beforehand. I should have beforehand, but this is just kind of off the cuff. But I would say, that's got to be one of the most sensitive issues of our time. And of course, it's very, very controversial. But let me just mention this. There's a professor at Stanford Law, Hank Greeley. He's an ethics professor there. I really like listening to this guy. My late wife was a Stanford alum. We'd go in and hear him at the ethics presentations that he would make. And Arnold Schwarzenegger, our former governor, put Hank Greeley, by the way, Hank Greeley is pro-choice, very clearly pro-choice. But he put Hank Greeley on a commission a state commission to deal with a similar issue. I don't think it was abortion. I think it was cloning was what it was. But I remember Hank Greeley talking about this and his experience on this. He said there were a lot of Catholic priests, number of Catholic priests and scholars on this commission. He said, I didn't agree with their position on abortion. They would be pro-life, I would be pro-choice. But he said, I got to know these guys. They were scholarly. And he said, I saw that there was a basic difference, and that is that they believed that the fetus, and the fertilized egg was, or I guess he used the term fetus, was human life. And he said, when I realized that, he said, their positions are entirely logical if you accept that premise. He said, I don't accept that premise. But he said, once you believe that the fetus is human life, then the rest of the beliefs about abortion and cloning and so forth follow. And so he said the idea that Hank Greeley was saying is that it's not like these people are mean or angry or they're trying to hurt people or control people, but they have a very serious and clear ethical position like this. So backing out of the illustration here, I'm now back talking to Dave and to the evangelist. That's a way that I would approach it. Try to think of somebody from their point of view that says something that opens the door to talk more politely about the controversial issue. And I'd want to hone that illustration so that I use it more precisely. There are others that I could use about gay marriage and things too, but I've talked too much about that. I'll be glad to. I had one on the tip of my tongue about gay marriage, but it escaped me. Maybe it'll come back to me in a moment. But Dave, let me pass it back to you.
Here's one on social media. Social media has led to a proliferation of fake news. What should we do when a social media site like Facebook is spreading false stories about our ministry?
Very good question. I should say that I am social media challenged. I don't use social media myself, actually. I was kind of turned off by it in the early days of MySpace and stuff when you'd get things like, I had Cheerios for breakfast. I thought, I don't want to spend my time with that. Now I've got so many openings through God's grace writing about these movies, and I send my articles out to a syndicate of publishers who publish them, and they use social media and get them on Facebook all over the place. So I leave that aspect of it to them. But if somebody is dissing you on Facebook, I guess there's several things that I would say. First of all, whenever somebody criticizes me, I try to disarm them by finding something nice to say about them. And it might, in the training that I do about communicating with secular audiences, and you'll see there's a link to it. I believe the link is in your information there, about after an abortion, a doctor who performed abortions was murdered by a pro-life activist in church, actually shot him in the face, and as he was a deacon or usher in his Lutheran church. And a day or two after that, Anderson Cooper was interviewing Warren Hearn, an abortion doctor in Boulder, Colorado, about this. And Warren Hearn had just lost his good friend and was understandably upset, but he was also making some statements that were really off the wall about the pro-life movement. And so I show that to people, and it gets them really mad. It got me mad when I first saw it. And then I think, okay, how can you identify with this person? What positive things can you say about him? And, we scratch our heads for a while, and you say, well, he's very committed to his point of view. He obviously was hurt because he just lost this friend. And so I would try to find positive things about the people that are criticizing you and say, I'm grateful that in the United States of America we have freedom of speech, and I'm grateful for the proliferation of the media that we can get the word out about lots of things like this. And I appreciate, Joe, Facebook disser, or whatever the person's name is, but don't be sarcastic. His desire for truth. And, I've been hurt by people too, and I'm upset when I see some things. And again, I'm still in character here in this illustration, in what I say about the Facebook. I've had people say some things that just seem really off the wall, and I think, how in the world could you say something like that? And yet, as I look at this particular criticism, I have to offer point A and point B just as a suggestion that I think I would politely suggest that you're off target on this. So now again, that's my approach. I try to kill them with kindness. Other people want to jab more. Killing with kindness is my approach. I remember Jimmy Carter when he was running for president, before the Democratic primaries. Scoop Jackson, the senator, longtime senator from Washington, I believe, was one of his opponents, and Scoop Jackson was trashing Carter, and I think it was Roger Mudd who asked Jimmy Carter what he thought of Scoop Jackson, and Jimmy Carter said, Senator Jackson is a dedicated public servant. I'm honored to know him, and he's devoted many, many years to the service of our country, and I've enjoyed working with him in the past, and I know I'll enjoy working with him in the future when I'm in the White House and he's still in the Senate. So, but the way Jimmy did it, it wasn't vindictive or bitter. It was killing him with kindness, is what Roger Mudd said, and also, getting just a light little jab in there. Sort of, I'll call that a Luis Palau type jab. Okay. Another question.
Yeah, and I'm not sure this is a question or just a comment out of frustration. Rusty, your audience for this webinar are evangelists, and most mainstream media people don't think evangelists are newsworthy unless they are looking to paint us in a negative light. So why should we engage secular media if it's going to hurt us more than help us?
I feel your pain. I hear the frustration. I think I played my cards fairly well in the media, and most of the times the media is kind to me, but sometimes they haven't been. I've been on campuses where they've had cartoons that that spoof me in ways that are sometimes vulgar. I would encourage you to look at this as a challenge. Not everything I touch turns to gold. Like I say, I've had people that have criticized me. Not every person that I'm kind to is kind back to me. But there are loads of people out there who will, media gatekeepers, who will respond to somebody. They've maybe never seen a Christian who's been kind or gracious. When they are angry with you, they may be angry at their aunt who preaches the gospel at them too much, just pushes at them, or with a bad church experience, or a girlfriend or boyfriend that left them after becoming a Christian because they had different moral values or whatever. There could be all kinds of things going on like this. So frankly, I would say to the person, anybody who's asking this question, I applaud you for asking it, and I can understand your frustration. But I would encourage you to try to put on your thinking cap. And the course that I teach on communicating with secular audiences, I just taught it at a writers conference that was held at Wheaton College. What are we in July? It was earlier this month, and no, excuse me, it was last month. But anyway, the workshops for that are linked to in your handout there about communicating with secular audiences, and especially the Advocacy Apologetics workshop, which is basically how to become an advocate for the person that disagrees with you, how to get on their side of the table. I would encourage you to work hard to try to think of questions that you can ask them that would help you get on their side of the table. And in the notes there's a long list of questions that you could ask of somebody who's of a point of view that's different from yours. It takes work, folks. It's very easy to slip back into the cliches that we've all known. You'll hear sometimes, and I thank God for these brothers and sisters who are doing this, but they'll slip into Christianese, or they'll just do things that kind of make the secular media gatekeeper or the listeners feel uncomfortable. It takes hard work to analyze your audience and to try to think through, why is this secular gatekeeper angry toward Christians? Are there things that maybe Christians have done that I should admit, or that maybe that I've done and I should admit and apologize? But I would encourage you to not give up, because it does take hard work. And my first wife, Linda Rainey, was a professional writer when we met. She wrote for the Ladies' Home Journal and Christianity Today, and she would be very. I'm grateful that she coached me and helped me so much. And audience analysis is very, very hard work to think through. Where is your audience religiously? What are their needs and their goals and their heroes and their aspirations and their biases? And to write all those things down and then figure out, okay, how can I get from my message where I am to where they are? It's hard work, and I'd encourage Christian communicators to work hard to try to find things that can help them get on the same side of the table of the skeptic, even just one or two things that you can agree with. Enough of my speech there.
All right. Last question. Again, thanks to our workshop and webinar participants for hanging in with us. We evangelists are reporters for history's greatest news story, but we are not always very good storytellers. What can we do to become better communicators of the good news of Jesus Christ?
Well, I think storytelling is really a great way to do that. I was a skeptic before I became a Christian, and Christian evidences helped convince me, evidence for the resurrection, New Testament documents. And early in my career, I would major on the evidences, which are important. But then I discovered, that's not where most people are. Most people are dealing with emotions, and they're dealing with felt needs, and they're much more interested in stories than they are in facts. And so I would use stories as introductions to facts. There's an article, my late wife, Meg Corpy, died a year ago in June. And during her decline, I felt God impressing me to say something at her memorial service, which can be kind of risky for a recent widower. And so I agreed to do that. And at the memorial service, I basically told some stories. And Dan Wooding, one of my publishers, asked me to put my tribute in an article, and so I did. And it's on our website. If you go to rustywright.com and look under relationships, it's the first one under relationships, and it's called Tell Her You Love Her. And that's the stories that I told service. And I started out by telling, including some stories about her and my relationship and some funny stories about us. And then I transitioned by using and growing up in Miami, and we learned Hanukkah songs along with Christmas songs while I was in school and stuff like that, and got I Know My Redeemer Lives. I think that could be a good example of showing how to use stories to move into a gospel presentation. And so I really, really encourage relationships, about experiences. And the guy, my mentor, Bob Prawl, who was the Campus Crusade director at Duke when I was there, he ministered by walking around and telling stories, kind of similar to somebody else. So tell stories. That would be my main suggestion there.